Welcome to War Movie Theatre, which, in a development that surprised no one as much as us, is this week sponsored by the Canadian Tourist Board. That's right, we're watching 49th Parallel. I'm Rob Hutton, and I've just got back from a long trapping expedition far from the news. As I was finding out whether I'd missed anything important, a young man with a strange accent crashed through the door, leading a party of Nazis. But how many of them will he kill in the next 2 hours? Hello, Duncan Weldon.
Hello, Rob.
And who's this stuffing a scarecrow in an idyllic community of expats? It's the author of Believable Lies, the amazing true story of Britain's World War II fake news operation, Terry Stiastny. Hello, Terry.
Hello, I've got a special bonnet as well.
You're looking delightful. 49th Parallel, the film that we're doing, known in America sometimes as The Invaders, but I think I was looking at it last night, I think now in America largely known as 49th Parallel, is a 1941 Powell and Pressburger tale of a Nazi U-boat crew who find themselves stranded in northern Canada and set out on a murderous journey to the US border. Terry, it was your choice. Why did you pick it?
I picked it because it's kind of a really interesting early example of Powell and Pressburger and how they go about making these kind of big, grand films full of landscape and history. But it's also a really explicit piece of propaganda. I mean, it was created because Michael Powell basically turned up in the war at the Ministry of Information and went to Duff Cooper and said, I would like to make a film about propaganda. And in his words, he said, I want to make a film in Canada to scare the pants off the Americans and to bring them into the war sooner. And basically the Minister of Information said, yep, go ahead. Here's £5,000. Off you go to Canada without a script, without anything else, and go and make this film. And over several trips, they managed to do this and lots of mishaps that we will no doubt talk about. And given that I've just written a book about, British radio propaganda in particular during the Second World War, this is actually a film that kind of shows that propaganda war happening. There are actual scenes of the Germans and the Brits and the Canadians and the Americans trading, their version of what's going on in the story. And so to me, that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, tell us a bit more about your book as you've mentioned it. It's sort of, when you told me you were doing it, my immediate thought was, oh yes, that, because it was one of the ones I'd had on a list as a possible sort of, well, there's a great story here. Give us the pitch.
The pitch is that this was how Britain deliberately created fake news during the Second World War. They had radio stations which were secret, they were hidden out in the country near Woburn Abbey, and they were broadcasting into occupied and enemy Europe in German, in French, in other European languages. But also it was a cast of characters who created this, who went on to do really interesting things. People like Richard Crossman, Sefton Delmer, Brendan Bracken, who was, of course, the Minister of Information later on. And they were all feuding amongst themselves. They all had secrets in their personal lives. And so although they were arguing about kind of the ethics of should we tell the truth, should we lie to the enemy, what's the best way to win the war, they were all sort of conducting this kind of discussion in a secret way amongst themselves about their own lives.
It's great fun. It's a tremendous story. And it as you say, it's sort of, you're talking mainly about sort of propaganda towards the Germans, but another big aspect of what the British are trying to do in 40 and 41 is get America more involved in a war in Europe in a way that possibly there are parallels with today, but it's sort of trying to persuade the Americans that this is a fight that ultimately will end up involving them, that it's their fight.
Yes, absolutely. The whole sort of premise of this film is that if the Nazis who land in Canada and go through on this sort of murderous rampage, if they get to America, because America at this point hasn't joined the war, then they will be safe. And, the idea is that this evil Nazi could theoretically escape across the border into the States and then just be sent home and be fine. And so they're trying to say, look, you really, really don't want to be harboring Nazis. Look at the terrible things they have done. I mean, in a similar way, I suppose there's kind of, you could call it the Canadian Casablanca, but I'm sure we'll get into why the two films don't really compare that much. But it is a film with the same idea that, we should show the Americans the terrible things that are going on in Europe and that way convince them that it's in their interest to join the war.
Duncan, had you seen it before?
I hadn't, and I was going to say, we'll talk at the end what we thought about the film, but one thing I really like about doing this podcast is it appears every season I'm sort of set a different Powell and Pressburger film as sort of homework to watch. I wasn't. That's one of those things that I was obviously familiar with their work, but I hadn't watched very much. This was the first time I'd seen this film, and as I didn't read anything about it before I went into watching it, and was just continually amazed as yet more members of the cast appeared, and I realised, what a star-studded film this was for the early 40s.
I mean, it's interesting because there's a version of Powell and Pressburger that's the red shoes and that kind of thing, but actually it's impossible to think about them and not think about the war, because they meet making, I think it's not technically, the war hasn't quite broken out when they meet, I think, but effectively all of their early collaborations are war films. They are both, really in the war mentally. Pressburger obviously is a refugee and fully understands why this has to be.
This is the third one we've done, isn't it?
I think it might be the fourth. I'm not sure. I'm now looking down the list every so often and think, which we have to spread them out.
Yeah.
But and at the same time, they're all sort of they're all completely unwar films in funny ways. So sort of Canterbury Tale, which we did last season, which I think we agreed was the strangest war film we'd done, which is, by that stage you're moving towards the end of the war, whereas this is kind of their breakthrough moment. I think it's fair to say they have worked together on two other films. I think One of Our Aircraft Is Missing is before this, but this. I mean, well, Terry, let's talk about the making of this, because I the bit of this I couldn't believe is as you say, the bit where they just switch up and say, I'd like to make a film set in Canada, and somebody writes you a huge check and said, well, go to Canada. I understand it's lovely.
I mean, that doesn't sound radically dissimilar to streaming television commission 3 or 4 years ago before.
But you're doing this during the war, and they've got to travel out, across the Atlantic during the war, and when they go on their first trip, and then Emmerich Pressburger comes back, and as you say, he's a refugee, and he's almost interned, and they have to write off and say, no, he is allowed to come back into the UK. He is actually, living here. He is, and sort of take this up with the government at quite a high level. And it's interesting how kind of their view of it changes, because when they start working on the film, it's kind of part of the phony war. It's in sort of mid 1940, and then as they start making it, and as they're traveling across to Canada and back, the war is coming closer and closer to home, and they're having to try and spring people from military service. So they're like, well, can we get Laurence Olivier to be in this film? Well, he's got a few weeks free before he's got to go off and join the forces, and Leslie Howard likewise. And they're one of the women that they want to star in it, a German actress. She basically leaves to go to America, because she comes to Canada and then sort of does a bunk, and they have to replace her later on. So the film is evolving as the war is evolving, and I think what's interesting to look back now, think the whole premise, the setup of it is there's this great rousing Vaughan Williams score, and you've got opening shots of sort of Canadian landscapes, and they call the US-Canadian border the only undefended frontier in the world. And there's a big sort of opening sort of voiceover that says, I see a long straight line athwart a continent, a line drawn by men upon a map nearly a century ago, accepted with a handshake and kept ever since. And it's on this premise, which we haven't really had questioned until about last year, that the US-Canadian border is a totally friendly border, and nothing bad can ever happen there. And you suddenly have Donald Trump turning up and saying, well, it's just a line drawn across a map. Who on earth did that? Why would we be doing that?
He sees it too.
Perhaps he's seen the film.
But they get unlucky with the timing, don't they? Because this is very, very clearly a film, like Casablanca, aimed at bringing America into the war. But by the time it's released, America is in the war. Yeah.
By the time it's released in America, so it comes out in the UK in October 1941, when there's still an argument to make, but it doesn't come out in the States until until early 1942. By which time, yes, they are in the war.
Yeah, I mean, Casablanca is commissioned after Pearl Harbor,
but set just before it.
But it's why we're in the war. But I think it does incredibly well in the States. I'm interested by how well it does, because even for early Powell and Pressburger is still slightly unconventional, slightly sort of not not following the standard Hollywood model, but it wins Pressburger an Oscar for, I think, its best story is how they put it in those days, and it apparently makes $5 million in the US, which is unprecedented for a British film.
Because it's long as well.
Popular.
It's 2 hours long, which is a long time for an
Yeah.
early 40s film. I mean, I think of them more as 90, 100 minutes rather than
one in which there's a bunch of action at the beginning, and then there's some action at the end. But there's this long. Well, I mean, we'll sort of talk about it. But there's this long central section in the Hutterite community, which is where Powell and Pressburger's heart really is, in a way. Where people are talking about what does it mean to be what does national identity mean to you, and this kind of thing. It's as I say, it's very not a film that I would have expected to do incredibly well in the US box office in 42.
And also in the UK, I mean, they have bad luck with their timing, because when you look back at the reviews, so Dilys Powell in the Sunday Times, it came out in the same week as the UK as Citizen Kane, and she says so that's
a tough week.
That's kind of is a tough week.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, there are 2 reviews in the Sunday Times in 1941, and Dilys Powell says it's an occasional cut at art, but still a boy's story, which I think is a fair point. And then she says, but go and see Citizen Kane, because that's really, really good.
Yes, yeah. If you only see, although I guess I mean, people were seeing more than one movie a week. Yeah, that Dilys Powell review is fascinating, isn't it? That sort of talks about the fact that these are 2 long anticipated films, and then just hit us at the same weekend. Apparently, they cover 50,000 miles. It's claimed making this, which seems possible because they're not. Yeah, as you say, they go across for a scouting trip and then they come back, and then they go across again, and an amazing amount of location shooting for the 90s, frankly, but an astonishing amount of location shooting for a time when every time you sailed across the Atlantic, you might get killed.
It's worth asking the question, which usually you would ask, Rob, of whether this is in fact a war movie. And that, I mean, obviously it starts with the action and German submariners and all of this, but I mean, it's on one level a sort of manhunt style fugitive-y type movie, but it's not even that. Lots of it is just, as you say, a discussion of national identity in a slightly strange Canadian Hutterite community. I mean, it's not. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously a wartime film, but I'm not sure I'd call it a war movie as such.
It's interesting. I mean, I think, yes, as you say, the beginning of it is because you've got, this submarine that sort of washes up in Canada. You've got people being shot down. You've got planes being stolen and conventional shooting. But as you say, then it does turn into more of effectively a propaganda movie, I suppose, because you have, on one hand, you've got the Nazis arguing, but, one of them literally says, Mein Kampf, this is my Bible. And there's a lot of that kind of expositional dialogue. There's a lot of people saying, this is what I believe in, and a lot of people saying, well, no, I believe in something completely different. And sometimes I think its propaganda routes show quite a lot, because there's some of the dialogue, it's not really about the characters so much. It is about they all stand for a particular thing, whether they're Laurence Olivier is the French Canadian, and he's talking about, well, as French Canadians we have freedom, and or the Hutterites, or Leslie Howard, who's sort of defending art and Picasso and Thomas Mann. So everybody stands for something rather than it just being shown through how their characters behave.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is always my question about all of the Powell and Pressburger films we do, except maybe the Battle of the River Plate, is this a war movie or not? Because they do just sort of found a completely different way of making films, which I do think is why you see these much less than you do more conventional wartime films. I mean, I think that's why I like you, Duncan, had never seen this before. The entire podcast is a Powell and Pressburger journey of discovery for me, because in the normal run of stuff that we watched on Sunday afternoons in the 80s, they just never put these things in. Now we can watch them and we can sort of think, gosh, it's beautiful and it's fascinating and there's so many ideas and so on. But I'm just always amazed that it worked at the time. Yeah, that people that J. Arthur Rank wasn't sitting there going, what have you brought me? By the way, Arthur Rank, the budget for the film is £68,000, and what with all the traveling, they basically double that, and the Ministry of Information, which has sort of hit its limit at 60,000, says, well, you can't have any more from us, and it is rank that comes in with the funding. But the film then does so well. Actually, one of the things we have to thank this film for is a whole load of British films of the 1940s afterwards, because there was a sort of, well, is this really the thing to be spending money on? Is this the time to be investing? And 49th Parallel does so well. They go, do you know what? It works. It satisfies, going to Terry's point, it satisfies the propaganda need, but it also sort of satisfies a straight economic thing.
And dollars. It brings in dollars.
Dollars. Yeah, it brings in dollars.
And I think you can see the roots of some of the other Powell and Pressburger films in this as well. I mean, the one I think in a way it's most similar to is I Know Where I'm Going, because it's got a lot of almost the similar scenes. There's fights at sea, there is beautiful landscape, there is somebody in a remote place who can only contact the outside world via radio. So a lot of the same ideas there, which are obviously sort of fascinating to them, and how do people in these remote communities live in a difficult time, and what do the outsiders make of it when they come in? So that's obviously a kind of a Powell and Pressburger idea that goes on into later films.
One of the things that Powell talked about was this idea that you had to think a year ahead when you were making a film, because it was just, it's one of these ideas that sort of sounds commonplace, but actually when you listen to him talk about it, it's quite profound, that it's going to take us a year to make this, so we have to work out where people's heads are going to be a year from now, and make the film that will speak to them then. And particularly in wartime, particularly sort of sitting in the middle of 1940 thinking, well, what will audiences want to be, what are the stories that they're going to want in November 1941? So much has changed in the war. And indeed, the thing they couldn't have guessed is what Americans would want in 1942. But interestingly, it sort of gets, there's an Errol Flynn kind of remake, which makes the version of this film in a way that I was expecting, where Errol Flynn is chasing Nazis across the Canadian Rockies. That's the more straightforward version of this, is to have a goodie who is the hunter, and in a series.
And there's a lot of sort of 1930s pulp elements to that. I mean, you got all of these, almost sort of these pulp, stories for boys tropes of, the Canadian Rockies and float planes and manhunts across the, all of this. It's very, you can see, you could almost imagine Tintin being in this story.
Yeah, that's good. yes, you could. It's exactly, and there's a way in which, I was joking about the Canadian tourist, but I really did think, my goodness, you do feel like I don't know what their journey across Canada was like, but you do feel like they sat there and went, right, we're having a float plane. Get Emery, you've got the float plane, write that down.
Well, they built a submarine. I mean, they did build a sort of a mock submarine in the Canadian waters, and then they didn't tell everyone they were going to blow it up. Only a few people knew that it was then going to be blown up. So this thing was laden with explosives, and they suddenly went, "Look, we're going to bomb it! Hey, great!" But I think you were just mentioning that one of the weird things about this film is it's supposed to be a propaganda film, but the person that, despite yourself, you're absolutely not supposed to root for him, but the only character that goes the whole way through the film is the main Nazi, is Eric Portman as Hirt. And he's absolutely evil. He's absolutely sort of speaking for advocating all the wrong things. But because, everybody else gradually dies off, not to give too much away, he's the one that right at the end, you follow through. And as you say, the normal version of this would be to have somebody who is chasing him, somebody who's trying to catch him, and that's the person, the hero that you're rooting for. So you've got a sort of weird Nazi anti-hero who's at the centre of the film for the whole thing, which is, again, a very strange choice.
Sort of imagine the meeting at the Ministry of Information. It's the one thing we didn't want to happen with that.
Well, I think there's quite a lot of pushback at the fact that there are not so much Portman, but there are sympathetic Germans in this, not simply the Hutterite community, but there are of the band of fleeing submariners. There is one, Vogel, who you would not call a Nazi, really, who just Vogel just wants to be baking bread, and and to have that guy as one of your central characters in in a film that comes out in 1941 when, elsewhere you've got Monty writing memos saying we have to kill the German. The only way to beat the German is to kill the German.
But that actually is an argument that's constantly going on in government and in propaganda in terms of how do you address the Germans. So the people that I was writing about, they were constantly having this debate. Are there good Germans? Should we be trying to talk to the good Germans, trying to convince them that, they're on the wrong side? Whereas against that, there are people saying there is no such thing as a good German. This is an evil regime. We have to defeat it absolutely unconditionally. So it's quite interesting that Vogel does sneak in as one of the idea, the guy exactly who just wants to be a baker and just wants to live a nice quiet life and has been forced into a war.
Well, perhaps on that note, let's go to the after action report. Quick, Dad. They're on the cable car. It's an incredibly episodic film, this.
Yes.
I mean, it like a lot of travelogue films. There's, it really is. I look at my notes. It's the Far North. It's the Seaplane. It's the Hutterites. It's Banff, and then So.
I mean, look, I'd quite like to.
Yeah.
It's one of those ones where I'd quite like to watch the whole thing, and the opening is very exciting. But in the spirit of the question, I am very happy to watch the opening 20 minutes and then be called back for the end. I know. that's not meant to be damning, but if I had to miss a bit of this film, the Hutterite stuff and all that, it's all beautifully shot. And it's really interesting.
Thanks. Emmerich Pressburger's crying now.
Yeah, in terms of drama and action, definitely. The beginning and the final sequence are
I'm not
suggesting
things.
a really dramatic
submarines.
You've got cuts and a Niagara Falls at the end, but I like the Hutterites and I like Leslie Howard in his teepee, but it's not something you'd call someone in from the other room for necessarily.
I mean, I have questions. We're going back to the Far North, which is I have questions about Laurence Olivier's French accent.
He learnt it in a week, apparently. So.
Really?
Yeah. I think he took about 6 days.
Particularly French-sounding name. I mean, it's perfect casting, isn't it?
I mean, again, there's a specific propaganda thing here, which is about French Canadians, isn't there, Terry?
Yes, absolutely. So the Nazis tries to appeal to Laurence Olivier's Johnny, who is the French-Canadian trapper, who, as you say, he's been off in the wilderness for months, doesn't know that France has been invaded, doesn't know that there's a war on, and is surprised. And then the Nazis try to convince him that, you would be free under the Germans. And he says, oh, well, the French-Canadians, we have our own schools. You don't know this already. We have... And other people in Poland and France, they are free. So he said, no, they are. I do not believe they are. Before he dies a tragic death. I love having Laurence Olivier. I kind of wish he'd lasted longer in the film.
Well, I thought he was going to hunt them. I mean, I really
that
thought
would be maybe the better film.
He's
but he
a
had
trapper.
to go and join the army or the whatever it was. So they couldn't.
There will be some vicious moment, and they will kill his friendly Inuit friend, and he will go on a revenge mission across Canada to hunt them down. I really thought that was going to happen. And then oh, that's not what's going to happen. The other thing that I like in that, and I really like in the seaplane, they steal the seaplane and set off for the border, is that you get both beastly Hun and useless Hun and squabbling Hun.
Yeah.
And the dynamic between the two Nazi lieutenants who it's just
You've forgotten to put the petrol into the seaplane. Yes,
yeah, but it is like I suppose it's this sort of thing that even all great drama at some level we recognise because it's an office comedy. It's the two people who just can't stand each other because he thinks that he's a self-important and he thinks that he's a useless idiot, and they're sort of both right. It would have been smarter to put petrol in the plane before flying. I think we can agree. But also, I can see that if you were trekking across Canada with Eric Portman, you'd be pretty sick of him pretty quick. It's so that's and it's those kind of vignettes that I just think lift it. That really you get to this point where it's like within the group of fleeing Nazis. Actually, it really did to go back to Platoon. The enemy really is ourselves because just because you can't stand each other. Very much like me and Duncan in this podcast. But I think that Powell and Pressburger would like us to be called in for the Hutterites.
Yes, and look, it's great. It's just it's the least cinematic moment, perhaps, of the film, but it's the most interesting bit of propaganda, I think.
And I think Anton Walbrook is he's the sort of the leader of the Hutterites, and he's obviously the antithesis of the Nazis. He's the person that wants everybody to live peacefully and to live in this lovely kind of communal rural life where people share things. And he talks about these are my brothers, and so he is he's the absolute opposite. And obviously the Hutterites are kind of community who've come from Germany at various points throughout history, and so this is it's a different idea of a different calm and peaceful world. And because Anton Walbrook is so sort of he's quite mesmeric, and you can't help but watch him. I do find that bit quite compelling, even though it's less dramatic, but he's got this kind of calm air about him, which I think is wonderful.
I mean, there's the speech that he gives, where so again, for people who haven't seen it, that Eric Portman, who is very much, well, we'll come on to whether he's the nastiest Nazi, but he's certainly a pretty nasty Nazi, who is the leader of this dwindling band of fleeing submariners, sort of having found this community of Germans, just assumes that if they're Germans, they're going to be Nazis, and makes this speech about how the great storm is coming that's going to take over the world and so on. And then Walbrook, who plays the leader of the community, just says, no, this is not who we are, and this is not what we're about. And what it reminded me of is Walbrook's speech in Colonel Blimp, where that amazing scene that we did a couple of years ago, where he's giving evidence to the internment committee, and the camera just stays on him as he talks about how Nazism had destroyed his family and destroyed his relationship with his children and so on. I mean, that one, that you feel like this is a dry run for that in a way. They nail it in Blimp, and if you've liked that scene in Blimp, it's worth coming to look at this scene which is bang in the middle of it.
He said, he says we found security, peace, tolerance, and understanding. And actually, the other thing it reminded me of a much later film is Witness, where you've got sort of a similar community. That's the Amish community, and then you've got Harrison Ford. He's the outside world that's scary, but they are sort of the calm people, and he has to learn to kind of understand their ways. So maybe Witness kind of drew on that a bit as well.
It'd be really interesting to know, wouldn't it? Whether they, I mean. Yeah, you sort of, there are. I had exactly the same thought that outsiders coming to people who just view the world in a different way. I liked Banff because we had our summer holiday this year, actually, as it turns out, replicating the 49th parallel journey.
Were you trying to get a steamship to Japan at the end?
No, we did end up in Vancouver looking over the bay and looking at cargo ships coming and going, which was great fun. And we did actually, we both went to Banff, which looks now exactly as it looks in this film. And also then we got the train that they then get on, the one that they hope is going to take them across the Rockies, is the train that we took across the Rockies, and it all looks the same. And so I can... Anyone else wants to hear about my holidays, but that was the one moment when other people in the house said, "Oh, look!"
And I presume this is.
Were you there for a big parade with
Well, we were there for the Calgary Rodeo, which is indeed which happens in Calgary, not Banff. But and actually, the other thing, I know we have listeners in Canada. The thing that's amused and delighted us about our trip across Canada is that everywhere you go in Canada, every event opens with an acknowledgement that this is taking place on the land of the First Peoples, which is I did kind of a nice thing they do. And yes, and then the fact that we'd look at watching this film set in Canada, and we got an acknowledgement that this was the land of the First Peoples, I found enormously pleasing. And modern Canadian audiences may also enjoy this. Yeah, I don't know enough about the Canadian relationship with, as it were, native Canadians versus the American relationship with Native Americans, but it seems more civilized, and they've found everyone has sort of worked out how to make it work. And it was I was quite nice. I thought it was quite nice to see this. Great. And again, Powell and Pressburger thing, it comes up in A Matter of Life and Death, is when you get to the heaven or whatever it is, and you've got people of all races sitting there which is incredibly kind of I mean it's woke, I suppose, is what they call it now, but it's incredibly humane, which comes out in the Walbrook speech, but also I think comes out in having, I don't want to call them Indians, which is what they call them, in having the Indian parade, and the fact that hey, here's another group of Canadian, who's sort of seeing all these different kinds of Canadians, and they're all different people, and they're all from different backgrounds, and but you know what? They're all united in a love of freedom and tolerance and a peace, and they're all anti-Nazi, which again, look, it's a propaganda film, right?
And the Inuit as well. I mean, right at the beginning, when they arrive in Hudson Bay, I mean, they're Inuit characters, and they are given speaking parts and a role, and they did actually use local actors there. I mean, yes, they give the guy a slightly, sort of dodgy accent or whatever, but they are making an effort to try and include very much all the different Canadian communities, so whether that's Inuits or French Canadians or native Canadians, so that is definitely part of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and it clearly, if you watch their other, it's not accidental. This is and there are bits of, right, so I mean, propaganda is your thing, but it seems to me that there are things that the Ministry of Information, there are messages the Ministry of Information will definitely have wanted them to hit. And then there are other messages that are just like Powell and Pressburger, like, no, these are the ones that we want to hit. And I can't imagine the Ministry of Information gave much of a damn about sort of racial prejudice or tolerance or brotherhood, 1940. But clearly Powell and Pressburger care about it a lot.
But this is an interesting thing, because obviously it's a propaganda film, but it's a propaganda film as much targeted at a American audience as a British one. And I think it's quite a punchy decision to sort of go on racial tolerance as your unifying theme when appealing to an American audience in the early 1940s.
Let us park that thought, Duncan.
Okay.
We'll come back to that in a future category. Yeah, so I love Banff, and again, the funny thing, because it's episodic, you get these different characters who just come in and are absolutely tremendous. You've gone through all this, and suddenly that, right? Oh, look, here's Leslie Howard, and Leslie Howard's on for 15 minutes.
It must be one of Leslie Howard's last films as well.
Yes, I think this was just before he went off, into the military, and obviously ended up was killed a couple of years later.
Yeah, no, he sort of. That's the first of the few. Is coming after this. Yeah, no, he's and he's great. And
he's wonderful, because he's kind of almost a throwback to a kind of 1920s aesthete who has gone off to go and live in the wilderness. And he talks about, he represents art. So although he's living in a teepee, and he's a novelist, and he's writing about the traditions of the native Canadians, but he manages to have a Picasso and a Matisse, which he manages to keep dry in his teepee, along with the works of Thomas Mann. And I know we're going to come to the other lines, but I do just love it when he beats up an art scene and goes, "That's for Thomas Mann, that's for Picasso, that's for Matisse, and that's for Hemingway."
It's great, isn't it? And again, at one level, it's a bit kind of like, oh God, are you actually going to throw the Picasso on the? You are. You are
going to burn the books. Gosh, do Nazis do that?
But yeah, I think it works. It works because I guess it works because you're at war with them, and also because legitimately, the Nazis hated these things.
Yeah.
It's not an exaggeration to say that these were the things that they stood against. And then
it's a film made in 1941 at a time of war, funded by the Ministry. They're not going to sit there and say, "Oh, should we have a bit more moral ambiguity about whether these Nazis are baddies or goodies?"
I mean, it's surprising how much moral ambiguity they have.
Well, within the submarine crew, yes.
So Vogel is this amazing character who sort of, when they get to the Hutterites, says, "Well, this is what I want. I just want to stay here." I never wanted to be in a submarine in the first place, and I think that the choice to have him was quite controversial, and but it works. Because it makes them all more human, and it makes Portman more sort of obviously awful.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. It makes your nastiest Nazis even worse. How that plays out.
So they one of the things that they'd wanted to do when they first started thinking about this film is the Agatha Christie book, which has various titles for various reasons, and it's now known as "And Then There Were None." They liked the idea of the diminishing cast. In that, it's because sort of somebody gets murdered each chapter. here it's yes, it's sort of they get some of them are killed by accident, some of them they kill themselves, some of them are captured, and you get the final sort of battle where Portman just going to make it to the United States and has this sort of confrontation again with this Canadian. I mean, with a Canadian deserter, for goodness sake.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre because you start off. It's quite cleverly done because you start off thinking that he's just sort of a hobo in a boxcar, and then gradually he sort of he is trying to appeal to him as a deserter, and then gradually he puts his uniform back on piece by piece, and then he sort of turns into a proud Canadian who's just gone AWOL for a minute, and he's actually all on board. But I love the fact that he's ultimately defeated by bureaucracy rather than actually by violence.
Yes, they find a way.
US Canadian sort of trade policy.
Yes, well, and they find a way to make the Americans, because the Americans go, you're neutral, you've got to be neutral, but they find a way, you're neutral, but you're not really neutral, are you? You want to help us. Let's find a way. Let's find a way for you to help us. So she's not so dumb. Are there women in this film? I mean, there are some.
There is one who speaks. And there are a few others in the Hutterites. And the one who speaks is Glynis Johns. And I think, she was a last-minute change of cast. So originally they had cast this German actress, Elisabeth Bergner, who had a long history. She was actually weirdly in her 40s by the time they cast her in the film. And when they filmed the exterior scenes, she was actually the actress there. So when they filmed out in Canada in the Hutterite community, it was a different actress. And Michael Powell had to suddenly substitute in Glynis Johns. So they then had to, I assume, change the script a lot because Glynis Johns is very, very young. And she in the film, she's supposed to be only like 15 going on 16.
Yeah.
Which I think is, again, a bit of a problem because she's a child. And so she's not, an adult woman who can kind of make her own decisions. She's very much living in this Hutterite community. And again, she's someone who's a refugee. We discover later on that she has lost her family to the Nazis and one to a torpedo on a boat coming across the Atlantic. So although she's got this quite powerful story to tell, she doesn't really do anything very much for herself because she's just there sort of looking after the visitors who arrive in her community.
I mean, she is a source of tension among the U-boat crew, some of whom clearly sort of have nefarious thoughts about her. And again, is this moment where Vogel, the sort of the nice member of the U-boat crew, is just thinking, why am I with these people? Why am I? She is. I didn't realise until I was doing research. Glynis Johns is the daughter of Mervyn Johns, who I'm very fond of because he pops up in lots of World War II films. He's, I think, he's the gamekeeper in Went the Day Well. He's the Nazi spy in a film called The Next of Kin, which I love. He's a absolute Ealing standby. You'd recognise him.
And I think, Michael Powell basically knew him and sort of said kind of, well, someone's dropped out. Can we get your daughter to come and be cast in the film? So, but she was doing mostly the bits that were filmed on set back in the UK.
And did you recognise her, Duncan? Do you know what? I will tell you, there is something for which you definitely know.
Go on. She
is the mum in Mary Poppins.
She is Mrs. Banks, the suffragette.
So, although I think she'd be fair to Glynis Johns, she had a very storied career and was in an awful lot of things. But that is, I think, the thing for which she would now be recognised. She only died last year.
Really?
Yeah. In a nursing home in LA, aged 100. Movie body count. Want to guess?
Oh, I mean, there's quite a lot of civilians at the beginning. Yeah. There's the submariners. There's
I'm not counting the crew of the submarine.
We're not counting the crew of the submarine, and we counted the other crew of the other ship who they then pushed back into the sea, where they.
With this one, I only counted people I could actually see dying.
Okay, rather than people who are just shoved into freezing water and beaten back. So, well, who do we lose? We lose the Inuit chap whose name I forget. We lose Johnny the Trapper, Laurence Olivier, obviously. And 3 or 4 of the other Germans, the other German submariners. So I think they talk about them killing 11 civilians as well at some point during the as they.
I think
and the man with the car.
Well, yeah, some of them it's like, well, did the man with the car die or not?
Some of them you can't see; they sort of die off screen.
Yeah, for a long time I wasn't sure whether to include Johnny, for instance, and then they come back to him dying, and
he's pretty much dead.
I got to 11, though I'm not sure how reliable it is, but I
think that's what I written down 11.
Yeah, as you say, there's sort of there are off screen deaths. Which of these is the best death?
Ooh. Well, see, the one that I think that is the best, I think the best on-screen death is certainly Johnny, because it's Laurence Olivier being hammy and kind of appealing to God and stuff. But then, the other, Vogel, you don't see die, but you know that he's going to die.
I'm giving,
so I think that's quite noble.
I'm entering Vogel. You can put Vogel in competition. I mean, we see him facing the firing squad. We hear.
Yeah, we know that he's. Yeah, we don't actually see him die, but yeah. But Johnny's death is super melodramatic, and it's Laurence Olivier, so yeah.
I mean, the other one I like is Kunica, the who's the pilot or the not very good pilot, just because I everything about him is sort of wound up man who is crashing a seaplane ultimately just to get back at his colleague. I liked all of that. Read into that what you will. Do we have a gratuitous American?
Well, and we have one American. Well, two Americans, I suppose. There's the two customs guys. I mean, they're kind of I wouldn't say they're gratuitous. They're quite essential because you absolutely need to have them there because they are the last line of defense against them getting into the United States. And as we said, they're there and they're upholding the rules to a sort of bureaucratic point of order. They have to decide. It's not a Rick in Casablanca, chuck the water, the Vichy water in and go off to fight decision. But it's no, we will stand up for the rules and we will observe them to the nth degree in order to stop you guys getting through. So I think they're essential America.
Yeah. And introducing.
Well, sorry, I think that has to be Glynis Johns again, though, doesn't
it? But also Anton Walbrook and Eric Portman.
Yes. Both, yes, I suppose they weren't as well.
Both in their first movie roles. I mean, I think if you're not a Powell and Pressburger person, they're probably not legendary, if you see what I mean. But and Eric Portman is, to listen to the podcast, familiar as the creepy glue man from the Canterbury Tale, and in this he's a creepy nut. I just sort of feel that he might there's something about him that radiates creepiness.
Yeah, he does carry the film. I mean, he does have to carry the whole thing, from the entire way through. So he does a good job of it.
But and he is good in it. And Don Walbrook, yes, as I think gives the film its moral heart. That's the thing. I think when you see people talking about it, that's the scene that you clip. Yeah. Good luck. Have we got a best meme? I would like a GIF of all of them standing up and saluting in their underpants.
Just for your own personal collection, though.
Just the priorities. Because that was the moment where I thought something that Al Murray said when he was on the pod, that some of these films you can just see where Monty Python comes from. That, if you had been a sort of a 10-year-old watching this, you might just thought, actually, that's just silly. That's not menacing. That's silly. And the moment where they're all getting ready for bed, and for some reason I can't remember why Portman makes them all stand and salute. And it's like that's actually, no, you can't take anyone seriously when they're sort of standing there in their underpants and their socks. And so I don't know how deliberate that was. Maybe that was intended to be menacing, but
I think also actually Laurence Olivier reacting to the idea that there's suddenly been a war and he's gone away for months and he has no idea. So, what? That was a war? What has happened?
Stiffest upper lip.
Well, it has to be Leslie Howard. I think.
It does.
Yeah. Certainly, defending the whole of Western civilization, art, culture, and then punching some Nazis into the bargain once he's realised that they've abused his hospitality and burnt his paintings, burnt his Thomas Mann book when he was only trying to be nice to them after all. He's terribly, terribly offended because they just don't have good manners.
Yes,
your arrogance, your stupidity, and your bad manners. And he said, "I don't feel the least afraid."
And he just walks towards the cave where while one of them is shooting at him. I loved all of that. That was great. Yeah, it is one of these ones where he's on screen for 10 minutes or less, and you go, "Oh, this is all fantastic." Nastiest Nazi.
We're going for Portman, aren't we?
It's Eric Portman.
It has to be Eric Portman. I mean, he's such a he literally says at the beginning, Mein Kampf is my Bible. He burns books. He shoots his own men for being disloyal. He's invested with the Iron Cross in absentia. So in one of the bits where you see the German radio stations, they're all sort of holding him out as a hero. And, the German propaganda radio is saying, our brave guys are fighting through Canada. And you think, would they really have done that? I'm not sure they would really have said, we've got a bunch of spies in Canada. Please try and kill them. But he's upholding the ideology absolutely to the last and absolutely arguing his case the whole way through when he's not killing people.
It's a bit.
Yes,
the writing of it's Herf, his character name, isn't the Portman character Herf? The writing of Herf does remind me of the joke from Garth Marenghi. I know writers who use subtext and they are cowards.
Yeah, he's quite Basil Exposition, isn't he? So I am a Nazi and this is why I'm evil.
I could have stood more of the radio propaganda stuff. Actually, I thought all of that was, as you say, the different ways that the story is being, that these events are being interpreted by the different sides. I thought all of that was really good, really, really interesting way of looking at things. The Dan Buster's Dog Prize for the most problematic moment. Have you got one? As I have.
I'm not sure. I looked at the way they were sort of treating the Inuit, and I thought, okay, there's a bit of the pidgin language there, but they're basically treated with respect. And I just do think having sort of a 15-year-old girl as your main potential romantic interest is maybe a little bit questionable. But...
I think I can beat both of those. I'm just going to quote the Wikipedia page. US censors cut 19 minutes, including the speech by the fanatical Nazi commander who claims that Eskimos are like black people and, quotes, semi-apes, only 1 degree above the Jews, which was removed to avoid offending segregationists in the American South.
Oof. So going back to my point about
that was your point.
So very specifically, the one thing you couldn't say is things that actual segregationists think and put those in the mouth of a Nazi, because that would raise some questions.
Because that would upset the Americans who you want to come into the war. Yeah, well, I didn't know that.
Okay, that gets there. Yeah, it's fair enough. Problematic moment.
Wins.
All of the problematic decision being from the US censors. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that wins. Loose Lips, the famous last words, the best lines.
Well, I think Terry's already had it with. It's Leslie Howard, isn't it? And this is for Martin, this is for Picasso.
The Leslie Howard one I like. I mean, I like everything he says, but Nazis, that explains your arrogance, stupidity, bad manners.
And Walbrook's "We are not your brothers" that's a pretty good one. When he's been talking to the to the Nazis and they're trying to persuade him that you're all Germans, we should all be Germans together, and he just very calmly says, "We are not your brothers."
Yeah, I do. I mean, that is very much the moral heart of the film, and that is what justifies having the sort of the sympathetic German so on, because it all builds to that idea of we're all having to make our own decisions about which side we're on, and you are on a different side. Broadsword Radio, completely implausible moments.
I mean, that's a well-stocked teepee, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a well-stocked TV. I have questions. I mean, having travelled across a large section of Canada over the summer, I have questions about how you do it without money or supplies. It's a big old country.
Well,
he seems to get away from the centre of Banff and instantly be in the mountains without having gone through. Is that true? Is that?
Oh no, completely. I mean, that all of that Banff stuff. Actually, it is a town in the middle of. I mean, there is some suburbia, but actually, I think that one I didn't have much trouble with, especially because I think I know the hotel, this place where they're doing the speech, and that's where I went on my Canadian pony ride through a river. Many highlights.
Are you now just worrying you spent more money than you had to, having seen this film, that it's in fact possible to travel across Canada despite having turned up with no money, no documentation?
Yeah. No... Well, also there's a bit where we don't see, where Eric Portman steals a plane, clearly, and then flies the entire way across Canada, sort of back from Banff, from Vancouver, ends up in Ontario without refueling, without anyone catching an escaping Nazi. And the idea that he gets away with a perfect accent throughout the thing, and nobody suddenly goes, "You're sounding a little bit German here."
Well, the thing that I found, the single most implausible thing the thing I kept thinking was basically every time in this anyone in Canada says anything sort of faintly like, I'm not sure about that Hitler fella, Portman and his more Nazi colleagues all make the kind of face. I just think pretend you're not a Nazi. Quite often,
You think they'd have been taught that?
They're very clearly thinking, I should kill this person now in the street for expressing an essentially mainstream Canadian view about foreign policy. I just think I think if you behave like that, you get caught sooner.
Yeah, he would get caught. So also in the middle of the crowd, in the sort of quite 39 steps bit where they're going, has anybody seen some Nazis around here? They look exactly like this, and then they look around, and then they manage to get away.
Judgment at Nuremberg. How many war crimes are committed?
I mean, an awful lot of normal crimes.
A lot.
Lot of completely regular crime.
Yeah. Well, I think throwing people back into the sea once you're supposed to, when they're on the submarine and there are other people who've survived a shipwreck and you are supposed to rescue them there, aren't you? And not
slightly live. There's a live question about what you were supposed to do if you torpedoed somebody. I think everyone kind of agrees that they're just ignoring that rule.
Lots of civilians. They then try and steal the uniform off a Canadian soldier. They kill people sort of variously as they go through.
Yes, he does. He does impersonate a Canadian soldier at the end.
He puts on his uniform and then it gets stolen back again. So
yes. So okay. I mean, if we weren't sure that he was a baddie by then, then
and don't forget the attempted violation of the U.S. Customs Code at the very end.
Well,
I mean,
that's ultimately what gets him. Yes,
because he should have filled in that form that asked if he'd ever been a member of a Nazi organisation. And that would have caught him. He would have been the one. Because he would not have lied. He would sort of, yes, I have. And I'm very proud of it. Duncan, is this the operation that changed the course of World War II?
No, it's not. And it's an interesting one, though, isn't it? I mean, I guess you could argue this film is part of a process intended to change the course of the Second World War by bringing the United States into the war. Although the Japanese turned out to be much more effective at doing that than Powell and Pressburger.
Yeah, though there's a good Henry Hemming's book, Our Man in New York, if anyone is interested in and actually it's what's the name of that? Restless, a modern novel. It was made into film about 10 years ago. It's about
is it the William Boyd one?
William Boyd, that's it. Yeah. Which is also about British security
operations. It's the way Roald Dahl worked.
Yes, in New York, which was something that I remember when they opened the files on this one at the National Archives, and it was quite. This is one of our more sensitive things because essentially it was Britain's operation to try to get America, if not actually into the war, then at least remind America whose side, who they should have sympathy with, and an awful lot of British spying in America and propaganda operations, sort of a lot of crossover with your stuff, Terry. Sort of what exactly are we telling and some stuff that was just plainly not true. But you can make an argument. I think one of the interesting things I thought reading Henry's book was something I never thought about, which is that when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, the American response is actually, well, we need to send a large army to Europe, which is very much not where the Japanese are. Part of that is surely the climate that had been created where, look, this is a world war and you can't sort of pick which bits of this world war you're going to fight. You have to get into all of it. And now that you're into the Pacific bit of it, you're into the European bit of it too. And I think so in that sense, all of that, obviously this does not in fact in any way affect America's attitude, but this operation, the propaganda operation, sort of helps to create a climate in which it's a perfectly reasonable response to an attack by Japan in the middle of the Pacific is, what we need to do is send hundreds of thousands of men and planes and things to England so as to fight their way to Berlin. All of that sort of makes sense, and I think it makes sense partly because of this propaganda operation. So,
Yeah, and I think it's also trying to say to the Americans, look, you may not think this war is on your borders, but it actually is. And you've got this massive, long, undefended border. And, if you don't start thinking about this, yes, the Canadians are on your side, but, if you're not careful, you don't know who is coming through there and you don't know what they might be up to.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, it inspires Hollywood to start making films about Canada, apparently, which they had not previously bothered to do. But it's interesting that the sort of the 49th parallel is a title. The one place where you might have thought that people knew what the 49th parallel was, they changed the title to The Invaders, which again is a kind of like, well, they're invading. They've invaded Canada, and he is ultimately, in fact, trying to invade America as well. I mean, in a sort of limited kind of one-man way. Worth dying for.
Yes.
How does it stand up?
First time I'd seen it, I think I've enjoyed every Powell and Pressburger we've watched. Blimp, I have watched again since we did it. This one, I will very, very happily watch again in a year or two. And I'm going to try and get some of my family to watch it. It was an excellent film. Yeah, it's great. Very, very good.
Yeah, I think it's got a slight clunkiness to it, as we talked about. Some of the propaganda speeches are more speeches, and we can all think of ways that it could be improved. But as a way into what Powell and Pressburger then go on to do, whether that's I Know Where I'm Going or Matter of Life and Death or all of their other great works, the elements are there, and they just learn how to do it even better.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's sort of. I think it's enjoyable in its own right. It is genuinely enjoyable if you like Canada and you want to see bits of Canada, which I do. But I agree. It as a sort of. It's funny because we're sort of doing these films backwards. We should finish with the first one. It's Spy in Black. So yeah, you're seeing where all of these elements sort of start to fit together, and you're seeing how these guys just have I always just feel like they're kind of standing 5 degrees off from everyone else and just looking at the world in a slightly different way, which is fascinating, and trying to make, as I said, sort of trying to do propaganda that the government wants, but also they're putting in their own messages, and they have this incredible sort of view of humanity that it must be really hard to sustain in the middle of a war, and they do sustain it, and it's wonderful. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you for suggesting it, Terry.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks for coming on as ever, Duncan.
And thank you to everyone who's listening.
Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to all the people who've emailed, and I'm really sorry I haven't got around to replying to loads of you. Do please sign up to come and see us at the Imperial War Museum. Do leave a review. Do tell your friends. Next week, we're going to be crashing through the embassy windows as we watch Who Dares Wins.